Hey YouTube, November 6th, 647, 2016. A reading from Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell. From the chapter, Cultural Factors. Culture and Progress. Economic progress depends upon both tangible physical factors like geography and intangible cultural factors like human capital, including what has been aptly called, quote, the radius of trust, unquote, within which individuals and groups cooperate in economic and social endeavors. Attitudes toward work and attitudes toward progress itself are also among the intangibles that combine with tangible factors like geographic features and physical capital to produce economic end results. What is tangible may make a stronger visible impression, but it is by no means certain that its economic effect is greater than the intangibles included in the concept of culture. Among the many ways that cultures differ is in the ability of individuals and groups to trust and cooperate with one another. The radius of trust differs greatly from one group, race, nation, and civilization to another, and these differences have major implications for disparities of income and wealth between nations or within nations. Trust and honesty. While trust permits many mutually beneficial forms of cooperation, trust without trustworthiness is a formula for disaster. The level of honesty in a given society limits the radius of trust in that society, and this can have an economic impact that outweighs many tangible advantages of a given society. The Soviet Union, for example, was one of the most richly endowed nations on Earth, if not the most richly endowed in natural resources. It was one of the few industrial nations with such an abundance of petroleum that it was a major exporter of oil. It contained soil of legendary fertility and the world's largest level plains. The Soviet Union also had the world's largest reserves of iron ore, 1/5 of all the forested land in the world's second largest deposits of manganese, and 1/3 of the world's natural gas, in addition to being for so many years the world's leading producer of nickel. The Soviet Union was self-sufficient in virtually all natural resources and exported substantial amounts of gold and diamonds. As of 1978, it supplied nearly half of the industrial diamonds in the world. Yet despite all these advantages in natural resources and a well-educated population, the Soviet economy was far less efficient than the economies of Germany, Japan, or the United States, according to a study by two of its own economists. The standard of living of the Russian people was significantly lower than that in Western Europe, the United States, or Japan, even though Japan was one of the most poorly endowed nations when it comes to natural resources. How could a country so richly endowed by nature have a standard of living below that of so many other countries with far less in the way of natural resources? The Soviet Union was almost a tailor-made refutation of geographic determinism. The other influences at work that offset the country's many natural advantages were both cultural and political. Back in the 19th century, when the country was more candidly called the Russian Empire, John Stuart Mill commented on a cultural handicap that would impede its economic development. The universal venality ascribed to Russian functionaries must be an immense drag on the capabilities of economical improvement possessed so abundantly by the Russian Empire, since the emoluments of public officers must depend on the success with which they can multiply vexations for the purpose of being bought off by bribes. The cost of corruption in an economy does not consist solely or even primarily of the bribes paid, the money stolen, or the goods pilfered. The main cost consists of things that are not done, the businesses that are not started, the investments that are not made, and the loans that are not granted, because the rate of return on such economic activities would have to be much higher to make such activities worthwhile in a very corrupt economy than in an economy in which the risks of being deprived of the fruits of one's efforts were much lower. When the Tsarist government sought to modernize the Russian economy in the late 19th century and invited Western business firms to set up operations in Russia, those firms hired Russian workers and eventually Russians in managerial positions, but they made it a point not to hire Russian accountants. Nor were accountants the only problem. A French observer in the early 20th century referred to the quote, extraordinary waste, to be polite, that reigns among Russian administrators, unquote, quote, as honest as a German, unquote, and as punctual as a German, unquote, were once common expressions in Russia, suggesting the rarity of such qualities among Russians themselves. Why and how these cultural differences came to be what they were may be lost in the mists of time, but the economic importance of such cultural qualities is plain. Widespread corruption in Russia continued, even under the draconian punishments of the Stalinist dictatorship in the days of the Soviet Union. Despite punishments that included years in slave labor camps, the Soviet economy had whole classes of people known as tolkachi, whose sole purpose was to carry out illegal economic activities on behalf of Soviet economic enterprises that could otherwise find it difficult to meet the goals set for them by the central planners in Moscow, within the severe limitations of what they were officially allowed to do in the government-controlled economy. The widespread corruption that existed in Tsarist times persisted in Russia throughout the Soviet era, as well as in Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The stock of a Russian oil company was estimated to sell for about 1% of what the stock of a similar oil company in the United States would sell for because, quote, the market expects that Russian oil companies will be systematically looted by insiders, unquote. Bribes of between $10,000 and $15,000 were required to gain admission to some well-regarded institutions of higher learning in Moscow, according to a Russian newspaper, which estimated that at least $2 billion a year were paid in such outlays by Russian students and their parents. Russia was not unique, though its great abundance of natural resources and low standard of living provides a dramatic example of how the benefits of tangible factors can be outweighed by the handicap created by negative intangible factors. Pervasive corruption can make the large investments needed to develop natural resources simply too risky for either local or foreign investors to take a chance. In other situations, however, the radius of trust can allow particular groups to prosper, not only in prosperous countries, but even in third world countries with unreliable and corrupt legal systems. Members of such groups as the Marwaris in India or subgroups of the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia have been able to engage in financial transactions with one another without contracts or other recourse to the legal or political institutions of the larger society. That is a special advantage in countries where the formal legal system is either ineffective or corrupt, for this gives members of groups with a wide radius of trust among themselves the advantage of being able to make economic decisions faster and with less risk than can other members of such societies. A high degree of trust within particular groups can also be an advantage in more advanced economies. Hasidic Jews in New York, for example, can sell consignments of expensive jewelry for one another on the basis of verbal agreements, and share the proceeds later on the basis of these informal understandings. The Marwaris in India have done the same across international trading networks. In Southeast Asia, the same phenomena can be found among subgroups of the overseas Chinese, and a similar pattern can be found among subgroups of Lebanese immigrants in West Africa and in parts of the Western Hemisphere. While a whole society can seldom, if ever, develop as strong a sense of trust as that among Marwaris, Hasidic Jews, or subgroups of the overseas Chinese or Lebanese, nevertheless, some societies have a strong sense of honesty and decency among its people, as to enable many useful economic and other activities to take place without the heavy costs and risk that restrict such activities in other societies. Everything from the use of credit cards to the collection of taxes depends on most people being sufficiently trustworthy so that recourse to the forces of the law can be reserved for that segment of the population which lacks the elementary level of trustworthiness required for a viable society on a large scale. While some theorists may tend to discuss people in the abstract, actual flesh and blood human beings differ enormously, not just from the individual to individual, but from group to group, and from one culture to another. Various tests of honesty reveal very striking differences. When a dozen wallets with money and identification in them were deliberately left in public places in various cities around the world in 2013, the number returned with the money still in them varied from 11 out of 12 in Helsinki to 1 out of 12 in Lisbon. Moreover, the one that was returned in Lisbon was returned by a visitor from the Netherlands. No Portuguese returned any. In Rio de Janeiro, 4 were returned. Earlier, international tests of wallets with money in them by the Reader's Digest found 67% of these wallets returned with the money still there in the United States, 70% in Stockholm, and 100% returned in Oslo, Norway, and in Odense, Denmark. In China, 30% were returned, and in Mexico it was 21%. Similar contrasts among nations were found in a 5-year study of which the United Nations diplomats paid their parking tickets in New York City, where diplomatic immunity shielded them from prosecution. Egypt, with 24 UN diplomats, had thousands of unpaid parking tickets during that 5-year period. Meanwhile, Canada, with the same number of UN diplomats as Egypt, had no unpaid parking tickets at all during the same 5-year period, nor did Britain, with 31 UN diplomats, or Japan, with 47 UN diplomats. More systematic international studies of corruption have found that most of the countries rated as most corrupt were among the poorest countries, even when they had rich natural resources. Honesty is more than a moral issue. It is also an economic factor whose presence or absence can be of major importance. Like other factors that affect income and wealth, it is neither evenly nor randomly distributed among nations or within nations. From Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, an International Perspective by Thomas Sowell. Music from the Ghost in the Shell soundtrack. See you guys in a little bit.